The Smell of Hay by Thomas Kiernan, read by Thomas Kiernan. It was not long after I'd come back home, after I'd married, and Steve, who I'd known in France, came to pay us a visit. One Easter Sunday morning we borrowed a third bicycle from our neighbour Jack, and Steve, my wife Alice and I set off on a tour of the nearby countryside. It was a warm sunny morning, and the hedges were beginning to bloom, and we were young. We cycled by a couple of lakes, called to a cousin who kept a small pack of dogs, and chatted for a while, and passed on by Dundavan, where Oliver was sitting outside of his pub at a coffee table, drinking a cup of tea. We cycled into the car park, dismounted, sat down at the table with him, and ordered pints. This time of year brings it back, and I'm older than Oliver was then, and now he's dead this long time, and I've good memories of him, and how I tried to save his hay over the length of one wet summer in 1974. We introduced Steve, and after some small talk I inquired from Oliver how his father was holding out, and if his cattle had much grass yet. "Oh, I never run out of fodder now," he answered. "I still have that hay you made for me 10 years ago." I kept a straight face and hoped that my wife would too. She knew the story of the hay. "Well," I said, "you never know." "Excuse me language, ma'am," says Oliver, "but shite, nothing had ever ate it." "Ever try putting molasses on it?" I said cautiously. "Feed value, 0. Any beast can tell that, even if humans can't. Why would I waste good money on molasses for stuff that wasn't worth the twine that tied it?" He could be humorous in an edgy kind of way that simmered with old grievance. I had to temper my words, because I knew how the thing still haunted him. We'd made bad hay ourselves that year, but as badness and quality went, Oliver's hay would take first honours anywhere in the country, and he knew it. And worse still, his neighbours knew it too, and at his bar counter remarked on it humorously and endlessly. "Lovely morning anyway," I remarked, hoping to swing the talk to a safer subject. Oliver assented and smiled, though well I knew what he was thinking, what he was always thinking any time I was around. I knew how much he blamed me for that shed full of ruined, baled hay that his cattle would not eat. I knew well. We lived wild and full that summer of 74, my brother and I, on money earned for cutting meadows, turning and rowing hay and baling it when the weather allowed. Those long days, the pounding of a dusty old baler behind my tractor, and the smell of hay bales hopping from it by the hundred, with the music and perfume that made life worth living. We were young enough not to let the weather dictate our moods, at least at the start of that particular summer. As it wore on, though, and meadows were turned repeatedly, only to get rained on, time after time, we bowed in spirit and became subdued in the wet of it all. Our own meadows got first priority. Father saw to that. He'd never sleep easy while one of his meadows lay flat and the weather was unsured. He'd be strung out and prayerful for bright, promised summer mornings where hay might be reared and eventually brought to the hay shed smelling fragrant as we forked it from trailers or buck rakes, breaking our backs, but happy doing it just to get it in and saved at last. At the start of that summer, I cut the 2 chapel meadows, as we called them, in early June, plus a couple of the wet fields that we kept as meadows and only grazed in the autumn. Even early as that, the weather showed itself to be treacherous, and we baled those fields with the hay still green and full of sap. We baled with the twines loose so that the air could penetrate and the bales could mature in outside ricks, topped off with forkfuls of hay against the rain. It was all we could manage in that kind of weather. The baler was working fine, an ancient New Holland 68, and we managed to get some hire work done for neighbouring farmers, a useful sideline for beer money that our father did not begrudge us. It was held for leather stuff in a decent season. In a bad one, it was more like dodging the showers, not cursing Providence too much, and relying greatly on our father's power of prayer. Oliver, we heard, was struggling to save his few meadows. They were cut a couple of weeks and were already well washed through when he met my father coming out of Caramass one Sunday morning. My father promised to send one of us down on the first break of good weather. As it turned out, our 2 tractors were tied up when that day came, so I borrowed a neighbour's tractor that had no cab on it, stuck on a lily rake and drove down. It was evening, I remember, and some dark clouds were on the southern tip of the horizon heading my way. It did not look promising at all. I rode up a few acres anyway, all the time noticing that the clouds were gathering fast. I got off the tractor and lit up a cigarette, and the heavens opened, like I'd lit a fuse for thunder, lightning and rain that sent me running for the house. I ran through the yard to the pub side and went inside and ordered a pint at the counter, all breathless and the rain running off me. Oliver served it up and refused payment, though I had the money in my hand for him. "The hay's not saved yet," I said, offering the money again, and the minute I said it, I knew it was the wrong thing to say. The dim silence in the bar and the downpour and storm outside seemed in good pitch with Oliver's brooding spell. We were the only people in the place for a long while. Oliver there inside the counter with a foot up on a keg and one elbow on the formica, smoking. I felt uncomfortable until I had a couple of pints in and the storm cleared up. The summer light dimmed outside to something promising and threw shadows across the ditch onto the road. I remarked that the weather might clear for the next day, but maybe the way I said it seemed not very sincere because Oliver did not answer me. I had to leave the tractor where it was in the field, there being no lights or indicators on it, maybe no insurance or tax either, so I got Oliver to drop me home. It was a silent, unsmiling few miles, but he did it, and I thanked him for it. We had broken weather for several days. I called down to collect my neighbour's tractor. The wiring for the lights and ignition was all burned out. Maybe it had been hit by lightning. Whatever the reason, I was responsible. It would have to be rewired at my expense. A few hundred bales to cover that one. The weather cleared after a bit, probably the result of my father praying through sleepless, rainy nights, for we had hay of our own cut, about 20 acres, and we tore into it with the lily rake and even with forks to shake up the heavy bits. Once more we baled it green with loose twines and built up the bales in stacks of 6 or 7 and covered them with forkfuls of hay and hoped for the best. During our efforts at our own hay, we were turning and shaking out Oliver's few meadows, so that when the last bale of our own hopped from the baler, it was a matter of minutes before I was driving with such speed on the Massey 175 that the baler fairly bounced on the road behind me. I could feel the clouds gathering overhead, and when I looked over my shoulder, I could see rain falling in Granard. Getting close to Oliver's pub, the rain was wetting the road behind me. I won the race, but only by a matter of minutes. I was in one of the meadows pumping out my 4th or 5th bale when the storm caught us. I shut down the power take-off, swung over the baler to road position and drove from the meadow. There was a whole mehel of Oliver's neighbours running for shelter. They'd been waiting for me all afternoon in the bar, instead of going out and cocking the damned hay with forks, and only went out to the meadow when I arrived. I was in no mood to stay, though Oliver urged me to have a mug of tea at least. I knew how it would go. Tea followed by a major piss-up, post-mortems on the weather and the hay, and myself for scapegoat at some point in the proceedings. I saw danger there and understood that it was a session to be missed. That night I went up to King's Bar, up the town, and my neighbour Jack was there, his eyes all divilment. He knew the whole story. "Well," says he, "how's the hay going in Dundavan?" I had to admit the obvious, that every time I went down there it rained. That made him laugh. "We'd have to get a mass said for Oliver," he said. I could not find it amusing. This business had me on the block. "Maybe someone he barred put a curse on him, some tinker or other." "Maybe," I answered. The whole thing looked like something you'd see in a Hitchcock film. It wasn't, of course. It was real, and I was caught up in it. A few days later the rain stopped and the sun appeared. Once more I had to borrow a neighbour's tractor, an old white David Brown 990 this time, and I had it on for Oliver's hay. I turned a few acres with the rake, and then the tractor stalled. The jinx had struck again. I remember I cursed and swore something terrible about that old David Brown, blowing and sucking into the fuel pipes beyond nightfall. And of course it rained. I left it there. I went out to the road and thumbed the lift home. The following day in the rain we had to tow start that tractor and drive it from the place, while Oliver glowered at us but said nothing. I was near to crying with the whole business, and Oliver, I think, was probably pondering shooting me. I couldn't bear to look him in the face. I wanted to forget it all. At this point the hay was not worth further trouble, and the rain continued day after day like it would never stop. But my father would not give up. Old friendship stood firm despite the futility of things. He watched the weather forecast every evening on the TV and promised a full mobilisation on the first chance of a good spell. We were willing, of course, but in our hearts we knew that the better option would be to buckrake the entire 10 or so acres of Oliver's hay into a ditch. When I mentioned this to my father, he danced about me with such rage that I half expected a box from him. The sunny day that we waited for did come, an uncertain one of heat and cloud, followed by another similar one. It was time for action. We all headed down, including Jack. He wouldn't miss this for the world. We turned the hay with a lily rake and shook it out with forks, and on the third sunny day we commenced baling. It was dreadful stuff to call hay, all black and crackly when you held it in your hand, and no fragrance from it at all. Bedding for mice, Jack called it with a chuckle. Oliver, as before, had in the same crew of neighbours, stroke customers, so with 3 tractors drawing in the bales, we had the job done in jig time in the early evening. Everything baled and drawn into a shed. I was driving from the fields behind the last trail load of bales from the heavens flushed us down with an almighty torrent of rain. Rattles of thunder and flashes of lightning were drenched in the finish up, but no one cared. The job was done despite everything. We congregated in the public bar, ate our fill of sandwiches and washed them down with pints, while the storm lashed away outside and shook the walls of the place like an artillery barrage. We were in mighty spirits, my father too, and Oliver drinking with us at the counter was in a state somewhere close to stunned relief. "You'll have this hay in reserve for a long while," Jack told him, "as good as money in the bank." 10 years later, the hay still remained in reserve, as Oliver bitterly reminded us that Sunday morning, a monument to wrong-footed efforts at haymaking in a wet summer. Now, of course, I see that some things need to be abdicated when they go beyond retrieval, and insistent portents need to be heeded, otherwise they haunt you afterward. The morning of his funeral, I left the kitchen across the old yard at the back of his house and pub, and went into one of the sheds, and the bales were still there, still tied up in red setter baler twine, and stacked where we'd left them more than 15 years before. Some of them had been used for bedding cattle, but most of them remained. The end.